Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. This is your channel for photography, for wildlife, and for wildlife photography. In today's video, an important concept that a lot of beginning photographers don't really understand, and that is diffraction. I'm going to tell you exactly what that is, how it impacts your photos, and why you might want to be concerned about it right after this. In today's video, we're going to explore the concept of diffraction. Now, this is actually a pretty important concept to understand, and while it may not be applicable to all photographers, there are certainly some photographers that must understand this concept. In this video, I'm going to explain what diffraction is, and as the practical wildlife photographer, I'm going to give you very easy to understand illustrations, and I'm going to give you real-life examples. By the end of this video, you'll understand the basics of diffraction, and you'll also see how it impacts your photography. Now, before I break out some of the examples in this video, I want to just define diffraction. Diffraction involves light, and it is simply the way that light works around solid objects. When we talk about light, there's a lot of aspects to this. We're thinking about the wavelengths of light. And one thing that's important to understand is anytime we have wavelengths of light and they interact with a solid object, it creates some distortion. I'll define that a little bit more for you, but I want to explain to you why it's important in photography. When light is gathered by our lenses, it goes through a diaphragm. That diaphragm we often refer to as the aperture. That aperture could be wide open, or we might use the term stopped down, meaning that we're making that aperture smaller and smaller. And this is where diffraction comes into play. I've mentioned that diffraction is the way that light behaves around solid objects, but it's also the way it behaves when going through an opening. And in our case, we've got that aperture or that diaphragm that can get bigger or smaller, and that light is going to interact with that space that's provided by that opening. Essentially, the smaller that opening gets, as we stop down our lenses and we close that aperture, a few things happen. I did some videos on this before. There's a couple of major things that happen. One is we actually just let in less light. That's common sense. The smaller opening, less light goes through, and we would therefore have to compensate maybe by slowing our shutter speed to allow the space to be opened for longer, or we might need more available light to compensate for that small opening. Another thing that happens is we change the depth of field. You'll see that in some of my illustrations today. I did a video on depth of field over here. I'll show you an illustration that really easily defines this as the smaller the aperture, the larger the depth of field, or the wider the depth of field is. It's pretty easy to see in that diagram how that happens. There is a third component of this that we don't often talk about. When we close our apertures down and we make that opening smaller, we introduce this element of diffraction. Because that light is coming through a small opening, some odd things start to happen with those wavelengths of light. And I'm going to make this pretty simple, but I just want you to imagine that light gets distorted. Visually, I always try to think of an easy way to remember the way something might behave. So I just want you to think of a current. Let's say we've got smoke, and we blow smoke through a very small opening. It would be concentrated as it goes through that opening, but it comes out the other side. It might behave a little differently. They think of somebody blowing smoke rings. They blow that smoke ring through a small opening in their mouth, and then that air, that smoke, becomes a small disc. And that disc is an important concept because there's actually a phrase called an airy disc. Now, don't get too bogged down in the technicality of this. This is the one technical term I'm going to put in here. For years, I thought airy disc meant that it was airy, as in space. It's actually named after somebody named Airy. Let me put an illustration up here. I think this illustration may help you understand how airy discs work. Now to start, I've just put an illustration of what light might look like as those wavelengths get passed through our lens. And that lens in this case would be wide open. This would be the largest aperture available. When I have that large aperture, the light is fairly undisturbed. It kind of just enters the light and it hits the back of the sensor. In fact, if I put another diagram on top of this, we could pretend that this represented the pixels on our camera, the sensor. Now, technically, these aren't pixels. We call these photoreceptors or photosites. But just imagine that each of these little photosites is very, very nicely collecting light. The light, by the way, would be in wavelengths. It would be three-dimensional. I'm just giving you a very simple to understand two-dimensional view of what this could look like in theory. Now, this is not a technical video. Remember, I'm just trying to make this as easy to understand as possible. When we get into optics, there's a lot of math involved. And to be honest, I don't have time in my life to go through and understand every formula and remember it. What I can remember is what the pattern might look like theoretically. So two-dimensionally, let's kind of look at what this might look at. Aperture is wide open, light's coming in undisturbed. But remember, diffraction is when light interferes with a solid object. And when I close that opening, the light starts to get, I'll use the term distorted a little bit. It creates that airy ring around the outside of what used to be a pretty nicely defined point of light. We start to get some disturbance in there. And as I close that aperture down, let's pretend this is at f8, and I go down to maybe f16. Look what happens. That airy disk becomes even wider and more spread out. And there's more, distortion's probably not the right term, but diffraction would be. So let's just say there's more diffraction of that light. That light has started to bleed over onto the other photo sites, and what we have is some issues with the quality of the final image. I hope that makes sense, because that's as far as I'm going to go with the technical explanation of this one before I just get into actual examples. What I want you to understand about diffraction is as I decrease the size of that opening, that diffraction coming through the lens is going to be greater. I'm going to get more of this effect. And as that effect increases, it can deteriorate the quality of my final image. I didn't really care about this the first few years of my photography. And the reason I didn't really care about this is diffraction is normally introduced in lenses when we stop that lens down beyond f8. You'll hear f11 as a common size of the aperture to start seeing this diffraction. Now that can depend on a lot of things. The actual lens itself, the magnification, there's just a lot of factors. And I don't want you to worry too much about that, because what you have to determine at the end of this video, and I'll show you, is what lens do I have and when does it matter for me and my setup? That could be determined by the size of the sensor on the back of your camera. It could be determined by the quality of the actual lens. You may see this at a different f-stop depending on the lens and equipment that you use, but I'm going to give you some ballparks when we go through this video. Now, as a wildlife photographer for years, I was shooting my equipment wide open. I was almost always shooting at f2.8 or f4, sometimes f5.6. But somebody that really likes to focus on the quality of light and often shooting in low light, I was very rarely ever stopping my lenses down. So for years, I didn't have to worry about this idea about diffraction because it really didn't come into play until I got smaller aperture sizes, maybe something like f11 or f16. Here's where I did notice it. When I switched my interest from wildlife photography and birds onto macro photography and flowers and insects, I started to see some changes in my image quality, and I couldn't understand really what was going on. I had a really sharp lens. I was taking some images and I would get it to the computer and I thought, wow, that doesn't look as sharp as I thought it would. I'm going to show you a couple lenses for this video that I used for the illustrations we're going to see. The first one is attached to my Nikon Z6 III. This is the 105 macro lens. This is, by the way, 100 millimeters, 105 millimeters, very, very typical of macro photography. This allows me to go out into my yard, photograph bugs and insects and flowers, and this is my walk around lens. Now, every now and then I will use a more specialized lens that gives me more magnification, and this lens I typically use inside. This is a Leiwa lens. I did a review on this. It's a 2.5 ultra lens to a 5x ultra lens. This means at its highest magnification, it will be 5 times more magnification than this macro lens right here. Again, macro lens means that we're projecting the image on the sensor at a 1:1 ratio. In this case, I'm projecting the image at up to 5:1 ratio. So you'll see some examples of this. By the way, I do want to mention, you don't have to spend a ton of money on lenses for macro photography. For years, I used a Tokina 100 millimeter lens. It was a manual lens that also had automatic focus. I'm going to put a link to that down below. In fact, I'll put a link to all 3 of my lenses down below. The Leiwa and Tokina lenses are made for other camera systems as well, but whether you're using Sony or Nikon or Canon or Olympus, you're all going to find macro lenses, and many of them are going to be in that 100 millimeter range. It is a very nice working type of lens. And the reason I'm going to use these macro photography lenses is because personally, this is where I felt this. Now, you can feel diffraction in all different genres of photography, probably the most for macro photography. You may also see it in landscape photography. Again, when we stop our images down, we stop our lenses down to get a wider depth of field, we will suffer this consequence of diffraction. I see it mostly with macro photography, and we talk about it a lot with macro photographers. First few years of macro photography, I was just having fun, wasn't too concerned about anything other than just taking some beautiful pictures. Some of my earlier work I'll flash over here, and it evolved into stuff that I started to like a little bit more, took it a little bit more seriously, and then I started to be a little bit more critical of my output. And when I saw that, I wanted to show you what you might be expecting when you get into some more of these detailed images and some of the complexities that you can have as a macro photographer, or again, anybody that's stopping their lenses down. I'm gonna switch screens real quick, and over on the side now, I just took a shot of a penny. Now I tilted that penny at an angle because I wanna talk about two concepts. I'm gonna talk about diffraction, but I also wanna talk about depth of field, because this is often something that we are concerned about as macro photographers, and sometimes landscape photographers are often worried about this depth of field. Often very narrow depths of field can have a certain effect that is appealing. It can also be frustrating because you lose a lot of detail. Let me just show you two images side by side. This image, by the way, taken with my 105 macro lens. And I'm going to show you two images side by side real quick. And this is going to show you the two different depths of field. Okay, so on the left-hand side, now let me just switch my view real quick. There we go. This will give you a little better view. On the left-hand side, I am at f5.6, and on the right-hand side, I am at f22. You can see a dramatic depth of field difference. Now, knowing that, I've got a lot less light on the right-hand side. I've got to compensate for that, and I did that in this case with a slower shutter speed. So putting it on a tripod, remote cable release, I didn't have to worry about camera shake. Everything is stable. I can just slow my shutter down to compensate for the loss of light. And you might think on the right-hand side, wow, that looks a lot more in focus. It's not that it's more in focus, we've just got a wider depth of field. However, and I'll show you in just a minute, what you see kind of zoomed out from a distance through YouTube may be very deceiving. There is a potential here that on the right-hand side, I've experienced a significant amount of diffraction, which in theory should deteriorate my image quality. I'm going to show you exactly how much deterioration that caused in just a second. Now, this series of images were taken with my ultra macro lens at the same distance as before. So you can just see it's much more magnified. This is around that 5x magnification. I've put the information on here. It might be a little bit tough to see, so I'll just walk you through these. The top left, you're going to see that we've got an aperture of f2.8. This is a manual focusing lens, and it also has a manual aperture, meaning I dial and change the aperture, so you don't get to see the aperture on there, but I'm going to walk you through this real quick. So we go from 2.8, top right is 5.6, then we go down to f11, and then finally we end up at f8 or f16 rather on the bottom right. I'll put those aperture values down there because it's really important. Again, you see a big difference in depth of field. You notice the top one, very narrow depth of field. By the time we get down to f11, we're getting a significant improvement in depth of field. But here's where I'm going to zoom in and show you some of these differences. I'm going to go into 100% on this. And now that I'm zoomed in, I want you to look at some of these differences. On the top left, we would have the narrowest depth of field, but we would expect it to be the sharpest technically because we haven't experienced any diffraction yet. And you can see that this fine line, I'm going to have you focus right on this area here where my hand is, and I want you to compare that to the image next to it. You can see that the image next to it has a wider depth of field. You may start to see a small deterioration of quality. It's not significant yet. When I go down to this image on the bottom left, and I compare that same area to the image at f2.8, but now I'm down to f11, I can actually start to see, and it's going to be a little tough to come through YouTube, but I can start to see a more significant deterioration of detail. In fact, if I look at this area right in here, this black spot that is in focus and fairly sharp, and I look at that same area down here, even though the depth of field is wider at f11, the quality has started to really suffer. And if I go to f16 on this lens, I can see that I've lost just about all of the detail. These cracks in the penny that were evident here are barely evident here. There's really no detail in these blobs. And this is the effect of diffraction. This was probably the best example I can give you. Now I'm going to give you some real life bug examples because I've got one of those for you too. But with this high magnification, stopping these lenses down, there was a point at which I said it is no longer acceptable. And for me, with this particular lens, I found that point to be right around f8. So at 2.8 I was okay. At 5.6, pretty good. F8 started to see that diffraction come into play, and by F11 I really could see it. I'll show you some more examples of that in just a second. But I want to first go back to that 105 lens. So this now is zoomed in at 100%, and you can see it's not quite the level of detail. It's not as close, it's not as magnified as that other lens. But with each lens, there were slight differences to what I found. So let me just walk you through this one. Top left is at f5.6, and then I went down to f8 on the top right, then I went to f16 on the bottom left, and finally ended up at f22. What I found with the 105 lens, and I'm going to zoom this in a little bit more for you so you can see, is the diffraction wasn't quite as apparent to me. So in other words, I felt like this lens I had a little bit more leniency. The other lens, I'm very reluctant to go past f8. With this lens, I found like f11, maybe even f16, I felt pretty good. I'm going to zoom this in, and we'll go up to, let's go to 300% just so we can really get in here. And I want you to notice this area right here. So this is at f5.6, and when I went to f8, not much of a difference there. And again, technically, charts, formulas, optics, there's going to be all kinds of ways to figure out, okay, where's diffraction happening and why, but this is the way I determine things. I look at the real life examples. What can I see with my eyes? Even when I got down here to f16, I had the benefit of this much wider depth of field, and I still retained quality pretty well. Now I did see a difference at f22. So when I got down to f22, these lines started to become, and again, it's going to be very hard to see through through YouTube. These lines started to become a little bit deteriorated. Now for me personally, if I'm using that 105 macro based off of my tests and experience with this lens, I'm a little bit more comfortable. So f11, not really much of a problem for me. Maybe even I want to go down to f16. I will avoid going past f16 though, because I do start to notice a difference in quality. So what does this mean for us practically? Well, practically, I'm going to show you one final example, and this is with an insect. And again, this video is not just about understanding diffraction, but also understanding your equipment and testing it out. If you are shooting ever past f11, if you're stopping your lenses down for any reason past f11, and I'm using f11 as kind of one of those magic numbers there. I think there's actually a mathematical reason that f11 is a magic number when it comes to diffraction, but I'm not too worried about that. What I am worried about is just you understanding that if I'm stopping my lenses down below f11, if I'm making that aperture too small, I will absolutely experience this. There's no way to get around this. It is a scientific fact that this is going to happen with optics. What you need to understand is where does it come into play with your specific setup. So this last example was really beneficial for me when it came to understanding my equipment. I took 4 images with that ultra macro lens, and I really wanted to pinpoint what is the balancing act. Remember, I've got multiple factors when I'm closing down that aperture. One of the factors is loss of light. Now I can compensate with my equipment here. I'm in a studio. I can just use a remote trigger. I can slow the shutter speed as long as the subject's not moving. So I can compensate for that. What I have a tougher time compensating for is depth of field. I'm going to give you a little trick on that at the end. But I had to understand diffraction and where I was comfortable. So the top left image is going to be that f2.8. This is as wide open as this lens will get. When I went down to the next image, this was taken at f4. The one below that was taken at f8. And then I went all the way down to f16. And if we looked at these, again, hopefully it comes through YouTube that you can see the difference. I can clearly see that the 2.8 is the sharpest of these 4. However, it's not significantly sharper than the f5.6. And I want you to look at the depth of field as it changes here. The depth of field in here, I'm getting some more in focus. When I go down to f8 in here, I get even more in focus over here. And when I went to f16, I got a lot in focus, but I want you to look at the detail. Look at the actual eye. I'm going to zoom this into 200%. We're going to get right in on that eye. And just look at the sharpness. Not bad. Still usable. F8, starting to see a difference. Look at F16. F16. It's not good. It to me is an unusable, acceptable sharpness. It's just not good anymore. And the only thing that changed was the aperture. The only difference is that is showing you the actual diffraction from this lens moving from one point to another. So if I had to get down to 2 of this series, and I open up these 2 images, on the left is 5.6, and on the right is f8. And again, I'm trying to get a compromise. I'm trying to get the widest depth of field that I can before the diffraction starts to say to me as the photographer, I can't accept that anymore. So let's look on the left. I already know at f11 it's too much. I know at f16 it's too much diffraction. How am I right here? The image on the left is at 5.6. The image on the right is at f8. And here's where, as the photographer, I draw the line. I'm right here in between. 5.6, I'm okay. F8 is the beginning of the end for me. And these are the 2 apertures that I typically have settled in on now when I'm using this specific lens. Now remember, the other lens I had, I tested it, it felt a little different. I felt like I could get to f11 or f16 and the sharpness was still acceptable. But with this particular lens, I am very concerned about detail because when I use this lens, really what I'm featuring is detail. I'm going to close this down. I'm going to pull up a couple images that I've taken with this really tight lens. And on a couple of these images, I will point out at the time, I was frustrated with the image quality, and then looking back on it, it really had to do with the diffraction. So how do you overcome this? Like, how do you deal with this idea of shallower depths of field and this idea that diffraction, if I increase or if I decrease the aperture to get a wider depth of field, I'm going to possibly introduce unacceptable sharpness. It's just not going to look very good. So what do I do? Well, one of the things you can do, I'll pull up this last illustration for you, is you can do a concept called stacking images. Now I'm going to show you this particular one because it's got some good and some bad in it. Now, stacking images just means we take, remember that penny we had? I'll show you the original, by the way. This is the original depth of field. But if I take multiple images and I change my focus point ever so slightly as I go, and I do that maybe 10 times or 20 times or 50 times, and then I use a piece of software to combine it, what I end up with is an image that will tend to look more like this. So what I've done is I've taken those little slivers and I've had software put all of these different focuses onto one final output. And it looks much better. Like I get the sharpness of that wide open aperture. I don't experience any diffraction. And then I put it together so I get the depth of field. Now, a couple interesting things, and the reason I chose this as an example is you can see exactly where I stopped right here. So all of this looks like it's in focus, and then it quickly changes to becoming out of focus. That's not ideal. The second thing that you might not be able to see until I zoom in here is that sometimes if we're not careful with how we stack those images, it might appear a little odd. So let me go in here tight. I'll go into 100%. What I want you to notice here is it appears in waves. So I've got a sharp area here, and then next to it I've got an out of focus area, and then another sharp area, and then an out of focus area. When I'm looking at it from a distance, it doesn't stand out. To be more precise, I would have had to do more stacking or possibly change my depth of field to make it a little wider. With this one, I think I did this at 2.8 because I wanted the widest open aperture, but this was the effect. So again, there is some software out there. I'm not sponsored for any of this, but there is a piece of software out there called Helicon. That's the one that I personally use. It's a pretty popular one with macro photographers. There are several. You can do this in Photoshop. I will tell you the results aren't as good if you do it in Photoshop, but there is some stacking features in Photoshop. But the idea is to get the best of both worlds. You maintain the sharper images by keeping your f-stop at f8 or f5.6. You don't enter that realm of diffraction. and then you use software to create, all of these in focus areas and stack them up next to each other so you can get a really nice photo. I'm going to show you one stacked image that I took a lot of time with. I had some insects out there. Again, I had to use a subject that didn't move. I don't like to freeze bugs or do anything like that, but I did find one bug that I could use. I'll show you an image, 5x magnification, kind of hyper focused with a lot of frames stacked together. This is the type of result you can get. By the way, I don't profess that this is my style. I like a little looser macro photography. I like that scenic macro photography with habitat. If you like this hyper detailed stuff, there's a guy I follow on Instagram, I'll throw him down below, Sega Optics. It's just incredible. So some people, while I'm doing, 2.5 to 5x, are doing 10 to 100x magnifications, almost using microscope type of work. And there it becomes very precise and very technical. And sometimes you're stitching together thousands of frames to get one in focus output. So really, really interesting stuff. So I wanted to touch on this macro. I spent a little bit more time on this video because this is where I felt it as a photographer. I know a lot of my following on Instagram, they delve into macro photography. We nature freaks often tend to have cross interests. So while I'm a bird freak at heart, I love my wildlife. Macro photography for me is just another genre of wildlife photography, and it's one that I've really enjoyed exploring over the years. I thought a lot of people might find this video particularly helpful as they may not understand this and maybe just glossed over it like I did for years as not something I really need to know about as a wildlife photographer. But as my interests changed, I found that I do need to know about it. It did impact my work significantly, especially around macro photography. And as I played around with my lenses, I wanted to show you that. There are some practical things you can do just to test out these sharpness levels, look at the depth of field, find a compromise that's right for you. And hopefully you found this video helpful when it came to a basic understanding of diffraction with my very limited technical explanations, but the basic understanding is now attained. And then you can see some of these practical reasons why diffraction is important to understand, but also how it can impact you and your equipment and how you might need to understand how your equipment works as well. So that's my video for you today. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you're not subscribed to the channel, I encourage you, go down, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell for notifications, and that thumbs up will push the content out to like-minded individuals. I'm sure they will find this one interesting. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.